Back when Pikmin 3 came out, Nintendo followed up its release with 3 animated shorts, one of those being The Night Juicer. In this short, Olimar is making some very tasty-looking juice with what looks to be a Pikmin? But really, it was all a misunderstanding, you know, he just wanted some carrot juice. Anyway, I love this short. I know it would be more fitting if it were Louis instead of Olimar, but like, nobody likes Louis. You can literally pinpoint the exact moment I said, oh, now this would make for a good sculpture. So that's what I did. The first thing I needed to do was create a sketch so I knew exactly what I was going for. I wanted Olimar to be holding both a knife and his beloved Pick Carrot. So basically the story is told completely through the sculpture on its own. In addition to the sketch, I downloaded a 3D model of Olimar to use as a reference, this particular model being from Smash Ultimate. So we're going to make Olimar's head first, and that means starting with his nose. To do that, we're going to need some aluminium foil, which I will roll into a ball and smack it on the table for some reason. Then I wrap it in clay, roll it around in my hands, and that is Olimar's nose. Worth mentioning that Olimar's head and nose are not perfect spheres, they're like squished a little bit. So I did that, I squished his nose, and then I threw it in the oven. Once that's baked and completely cooled down, I give it a good sanding to make it nice and smooth and rotund. Now we're going to start making his head, which requires an even bigger ball of foil, and it's at this point I realize this sculpture is going to be huge. I could have stopped at this point and made him smaller, but for the sake of your entertainment, I said go big or go home, and kept going. Here I'm attaching his nose to his face by literally just shoving it in there. Before I can bake his head though, I need to make that gingivitis stock photo smile. I start by making a worm of clay that is way too long, and sticking it where his bottom jaw should be. From there I blend it in with my silicone shapers, and then I try to carve out his mouth by making a rough outline and scooping out the excess. This works well enough, and now I can bake him again and do another round of sanding. I had to do a lot of sanding for this project, so that left tons of inconspicuous white powder. What I like to do is scoop this white powder into a plastic bag, then leave it at the front door of my local drug enforcement agency.
Hold on, it was you!
Now I'm using a hand drill to make some holes in the sides of his head so I can sculpt and mount his ears. There's no real strategy to making his ears. The problem is I had to make 2 of them, and if you work in any art medium, then you already know making 2 things that are perfectly identical is really difficult. And of course, once those were done, I sanded them down. Because I love sanding. Here I'm sculpting Olimar's most famous feature, his luscious locks. All 3 of them. Now I'm drilling some holes at the bottom of Olimar's head so I can attach this neck piece, whatever it is. Here I'm attaching his eyes, which are just 2 little noodles of clay, and that means Olimar's head is finished. For me, this is where the sculpture really started to come together. I even took a picture of it. But now we need to make the entire rest of his body. I wasn't really sure where to start. Most people start with the torso and work their way out. I don't have a stand or a base to work with though, and clay really does not like standing on its own, so I decided to start with the feet and work my way up. We start with some little pieces of foil, which I wrap in clay. Then I press an armature wire into place so I can start building the legs on top, which I forgot to film. Once the legs are baked and ready to go, I decided to turn my attention to Olimar's backpack. At least I think it's a backpack, I don't know what it actually is. You can see I have this armature wire sticking out. This is so I can stick the backpack into the back of his torso once I start working on it. Now for his lower body, my idea was to make a sphere and then just stab his legs in there. This did not work, so instead I resorted to piling on bits of clay, sculpting it about halfway up, then sticking an armature wire in the middle. Trust the process. After doing yet another round of sanding, it's time for me to build up his torso, starting with some foil. I snip off the excess wire, then slowly add clay and sculpt it to the form as best I can. Here I'm pressing his head into place, but before I can bake it I have to stick in some armature wire for his future arms. And of course attach the backpack I made earlier. Now he's ready to bake. Unfortunately, disaster struck. Or so it would seem. His head broke off in the oven, but as you can see it's a very clean break. So my solution was to mix some epoxy resin to reattach his head. The problem with this is it takes up to a week to fully cure, so this is way overkill, but it does get the job done.
1 week later.
And we're back. You can see it did leak in a few spots, but it's nothing a bit of sanding can't solve. Speaking of, it's time to Help me. After spending several eternities sanding, it's time to detail his torso, starting with his pockets. Not really much to say here, they look like pockets. He also has this speedometer looking thing on his chest, so I'm representing it as just a little square with some beveling. Now I'm gluing on the buttons, which are oddly inconsistent throughout the series. Sometimes there's 2, sometimes there's 3, sometimes they're red, blue, copper, who knows. I was going to have 3, but this third one gave me some trouble, so I left it out. Before I can move on to his arms, I have to make the items items he's going to be holding. We start with the legendary Pick Carrot. I roll some clay into a roughly carrot-shaped shape, which I then shove an armature wire into to serve as the stem. I attach a little leaf to the stem, add those weird little legs on the bottom, then give the whole thing a bit of texture. With that, it is ready to bake. Now we move on to his knife, starting with a little handle at the bottom, and a flat bit of clay at the top, which I cut into a square. After a bake and some rigorous sanding, this is what I ended up with. Now comes the hardest part of any project, which is the hands. My plan was to sculpt his hands as separate pieces, which will then be baked and attached to his arms. With that in mind, I decided to start with his fingers by wrapping some little worms of clay around the object he's going to be holding. Then when I add his thumb, I leave a little extra bit of clay to serve as his palm. Finally, I'm adding the metal rim of his glove and sticking in some armature wire. For the knife, it's pretty much the exact same thing, I just positioned his thumb on the back of the blade. Once those are baked, it's time to work on his arms, which were actually pretty easy. I built up some clay on top of the hands and then just shoved that into the armature wire, which my camera thought was impossible to focus on apparently. I was kind of skeptical about this approach, but I think you'll agree that doesn't look too bad. But once that's done, we can finally start painting. This is by far the most satisfying part of any sculpture, because it's pretty much the last step to making it come to life. Olimar mainly used flat colors, so no shading or washing was necessary. There were a few tight spots that were difficult to paint, like his eyes and around the hands and stuff, which I wouldn't have had to worry about if I used colored clay. Lesson learned for future me, I guess. Anyway, I don't have much else to say here, so enjoy the sight of me painting. And here's Olimar completely painted, but we're not quite done yet. As you can see, he struggles to stand on his own, so we need to make a base to keep him upright. For that, I'm tracing 3 circles to cut out of my favorite crafting material, cardboard. Then I slap these pieces together with some glue to make a sort of cursed birthday cake. Now, I know what you're thinking, and no, the cardboard won't burn in the oven. Before I bake it, I spray it with some isopropyl alcohol to soften the clay. Then I press Olimar into place, leaving impressions where his feet should be. Once that's baked, I sand it down as best I can. Then I paint it black, apply some more epoxy resin, then press Olimar into place. The fit is actually so firm that he can already stand on his own, but just to be safe, I propped him up on my shelf next to my copy of Milo Rossi's book. Once the resin has cured, my sculpture of Olimar is finished. I gotta say, I am really impressed with how this turned out. It may be the best thing I've made so far. There are a few things I would change if I could, like his nose is too big, his legs aren't straight, but the important stuff is there, you know? It looks like Olimar, and the idea of that silly short made by Nintendo has been realized. And with that, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think of this sculpture or the video itself in the comments, and I will see you all later. Have a good day.